One example is, of course, the struggle over property and land rights, which is why I wanted to set my book the way it has been set. And also in Shanghai for a couple of years, my wife Jen and I actually did live literally opposite a construction site. And in another place, I live next door to a construction site. So if you live in China for any length of time, there's a chance you are going to be personally touched by it too. So it was an obvious setting. But I thought these struggles over property are an interesting lens to view China with, because often those struggles are not government versus the people, but they're the real estate corporations versus the people. And I think lots of the struggle in China and lots of the upheaval and change is of a corporate nature, not necessarily a government nature. So there are, I think they estimate about 24,000 serious protests and civil incidents of civil unrest in China each year, and most of them actually revolve around unpaid salaries, corporate cheating, disputes about contracts, and they're corporate versus people. They're not necessarily government versus people. So the concerns I found in most of the people I knew most of the time were actually corporate. They weren't government. And I'll touch on the human rights and all that kind of stuff a little bit later on. But I found that really interesting. So I wrote this novel partly to kind of attempt to reframe the way that Westerners see China. And there's an abundance of writing from Chinese people themselves. But I think one of the valuable contributions that expatriate Chinese and expatriates who've lived there can make is that they can communicate these things in a way that is sometimes a little bit more digestible for a Western audience. So, I did wrestle a bit with how on earth I could dare to write a novel about China, partly from a Chinese perspective, but I think there's some value in that I'm looking at it in a way that is a little bit more approachable to us. So what I wanted to talk about today is I wanted to talk about the experiences of regular, everyday people that I encountered when I was there, because I think they're emblematic of the struggles that people have and the change that China's gone through. And I think it's very unusual to hear personal stories of China. And the current pandemic is a really interesting case in point, actually. I get a lot of Chinese social media, having lived there and still having connections and friends there. And when the Chinese were in Wuhan and other places were first confined to their apartments, there are a whole lot of really funny, heartwarming social media posts, videos about people doing, calisthenics together across apartment blocks, and all sorts of really beautiful and funny ways that people are coping. And all the images I have seen so far of the pandemic, and now that China has supposedly got it under control, we're not seeing very much at all, were all clinical, all people behind masks. None of that social media stuff was available that could have been shown on TV to humanize it, because we don't want to humanize China. We have these series of tropes and lenses we see China through. When the same pandemic hit Italy as ferociously, I saw on the ABC in the first week, there's really beautiful, heartwarming videos that Italians have made that sort of humanize them, but of course conform to our tropes of harmless, warm, lovely Italian people. And I thought that was really telling, that we don't see the human side of China. So this will get a little bit political, but I'll save most of the more political only comment to my other video. So, but for this one, I want to talk about some of these real human stories. So I'm going to tell you a series of stories of people I knew and incidences I happen to be part of or see that I think are really telling. So the first one is property. So we had a dear friend and her family, and she visited Australia, a couple of years ago for the first time. And she had a positive experience with property redevelopment. So I kind of made a point in the Nail House that actually most of the people in Jen's father's neighbourhood are actually quite happy with the agreement. And we hear these conflict stories a lot in Australia, but often these property stories can be quite positive. So our friend lived in a tiny level of an old what we would call a townhouse in a really nice part of Shanghai, but it was very poor and run down, and her whole family shared one level, so they had 2 rooms. It was later reclaimed for property redevelopment. At first they were upset, but the terms of lots of these redevelopments are often really good, particularly when local government are involved. And for every adult person in the family, they were offered a certain amount of compensation. And with that, they had to move out of that area to another part of Shanghai. But they could afford to buy 2 apartments, which meant that this lady had her own apartment that she could depend on. She didn't have a mortgage. And they had another apartment that they could use as an investment to help them with old age. And as the family got older, the children lived and used that other apartment for a while they saved for their own apartment, and they used collateral to buy their own apartment. So for many people, even though it's sometimes sad because they have to move out of their neighbourhood, for many people this experience is actually a positive one. And while there are very many negative ones, and situations where people have to move, miles and miles from their community, often these arrangements are quite positive. So there is a healthy mix of positive and negative in these property stories. Now, I wanted to also talk about money. So I taught at a university, and so for the first 2 years of my life in China, and most of my friends were there for other school teachers, and I had sort of friendships with some of my university students and their families. And to them, and the beauty of my university course is I could talk about all sorts of topics that were even controversial, and because it was part of a lesson, I could sort of get their views. And to these students, when I would sort of ask them for issues that concerned them, and I tabled some of the usual that I thought a Chinese person would be concerned with, money was always number one. And I'll give you a couple of really interesting money stories. One, we had a student in third year university, and I worked for a little language centre within the university. So I would lecture, and then I would do some night work with middle school students. And so if we needed an assistant in our centre, we would employ graduating university students. And we employed one girl who was from a village. And the only way that she could afford to go to university was this village pooled their cash, and they paid her university fees and their living allowance and her accommodation on campus. And the village would send her the money because her family couldn't afford to do it, in the hope that she got a good job and she could start returning some of that money to the village and help support the village and develop connections that would get other people out of the village. And to get home for holidays, she would have to walk down a mountain, catch a bus at the bottom of the mountain, catch a bus to another bus, catch another bus to a railway station, and travel overnight on an old train. So it gives you the extraordinary collective struggle and the centrality of money and securing money in modern China today. And so therefore, some of the other concerns that we think are really important are not. They're very much marginal issues for most people. Even now that China's getting richer and we have this sort of perception, and our current Prime Minister famously tried to kind of reclassify China as not a developing country. But for most of the Chinese people, it's a developing country, and there are still some big struggles around money and surviving. I also had one of my students who graduated and started working for a private language school. So when I first moved to China in the early 2000s, there were flourishing English language schools everywhere, because it was seen that English language was a ticket to a better job and a good career. And I would talk they would ask me questions about the West, and I would talk about all sorts of things. And one of the things I used to talk about was unions, and I talked about that concept to my students. My student got a job with one of these small English language schools. The boss didn't pay them for whatever reason and was trying to skim money off their salary. And she got angry and formed a little network with other language teachers, and they went on strike. So she'd read about and heard me talk about it and read about online the idea of striking, and she got a strike. She formed a strike. They refused to teach. And the boss and one of his assistants physically assaulted this girl, and she ended up in hospital for her efforts. And for many Chinese people, unpaid salaries and bonuses that are unpaid, which are really important for people trying to get back to their hometowns for Chinese New Year and to give their relatives and their parents money, being cheated of that is a really big issue, and lots of civil disturbances and discussions in China about this kind of practice, and more often than not, it happens in private enterprise, not government enterprise. So even though when I was first there, government jobs were kind of desirable in the sense that they were stable, reliable, and you wouldn't get cheated, whereas you could earn a lot more in the private sector, but people realised that there was risk associated with that. And so there were informal, we would call them trade unions, but informal groups of people who would fight together. They'd use their parents to help. There and there still are quite regularly in China blockades of factories and wildcat strikes and all sorts of things that are not publicised in China, and they're not publicised out of China. So and you know, for the time I was there was always something going on. Like I remember being at a staff meeting in a school, international school, and one of my Chinese colleagues had these photographs of taxi drivers in a line, and I was kind of looking at the photographs over her shoulder, and she was posting them onto Chinese social media. And I saw some placards, and I said, "Oh, what's that?" And she said, "Oh, the taxi drivers at the edge of town are protesting because there'd been some change, and this one was a government change to, I think, some sort of fee that they were paying to get into a particular zone to pick up passengers, which meant that it was uneconomical to do their business, but it was the only way they could do their business, so they're protesting about this change." And I said, "Well, why are you posting these photographs?" And she said, "Oh, a government censor has taken them down on this account, so I'm sharing them on my account. When they take them off this account, then someone else will share them onto another account." So you hear of these actions all the time, and I think we have this sort of image of subservient China, but I think that's actually a lot of soft and hard resistance to various things. But again, it's you often hear the most complaints in private institutions, not government institutions. Health. So I arrived early 2000s. Chinese health had been sort of deregulated in part, and it's a changing picture, and I don't really understand what's happened in China since I've left. So I've been out of China for about 6 years, but I arrived when some of the system was privatized. So under Mao and Deng Xiaoping, people had access to basic but free, largely free healthcare. So they'd pay a very token fee for medication and consultation, but lots of the big stuff was free. And Mao was very famous for barefoot doctors that would travel into rural areas when China was much more rural than it is today and give free medical advice and virtually free medication. But when I was there, of course, they were transitioning. So there was some sort of basic health social safety net. But if you got some sort of serious illness like a cancer, then it was expected that families pooled their finances to pay for that treatment. So I had a friend whose father had cancer, and he was looking for money to buy the rounds of chemotherapy. And from memory, I think it was going to cost 20 to 30,000 renminbi.